Welcome everyone to this year's Amphibian Ecology and Monitoring Talk. I'm Ash. I'm a teacher naturalist here at North Branch Nature Center. That means a lot of my time I'm out in the woods teaching children, whether that's in our local public schools or at summer camp. But I also help out here with our community science projects. The topical one today being our amphibian monitoring program, where we're facilitating getting people out onto our roads on rainy nights in April to help move amphibians across the road to get them out of danger, and just to raise awareness around this natural phenomenon and the conservation of amphibians. We are also doing some other community science projects here at the Nature Center, including banding saw-whet owls in the fall and many other things. If you're not signed up for our newsletter already, let me just be the first person to pitch it today. Oh, okay, 5 more people in the waiting room. Let me get them all in. Great. But great. Yeah, tonight I'll tell you a little bit about our amphibian road crossing program and how you can get involved, as well as just kind of give you a primer on amphibian ecology in general so you can understand a little bit more about these and just get excited for this like truly amazing natural phenomenon that happens to us in the middle, in the throes of mud season every year. Great. Cool. Thanks. You're showing us. Oh, okay. Thanks for letting me know, Helen. Let me change that. Um, Thanks for the technical help. Let's see if I can just do it this way. Gosh, sorry for your patience here. Oh, there we go. Um, huh. Can folks still see my notes? Ah, bummer. Okay. Hang on a second. How about now? Great. Yeah, I don't care. Thanks. So, folks, we're talking about amphibians, their natural history and conservation today. That's our frogs, our toads, and our salamanders. First, if you'll allow me, I want to talk about that word amphibian. Amphi, it comes from 2 Greek words, amphi meaning both, and bios meaning lives, because these are the animals around us that have really 2 distinct habitats, terrestrial and aquatic, and both are important for their life cycle. And it really allows them to sort of be a big fish in a little pond for their entire life. So we might be most familiar with amphibians looking like this. The terrestrial form, the adult form of these salamanders, that from a bug's eye perspective, are like truly top predators. They're dragons in the woods that are top terrifying predators to any bugs, slugs, worms, that are in that they might eat. Sorry, I'm admitting some latecomers as I talk. But at the beginning of their life, as they hatch from an egg in our ponds, they're they're still very, very small, but they manage to be top predators in those ecosystems as well, as they are a terror of scuds, of amphipods, of larvae, of insects that we might be familiar with, like mayflies or dragonflies. Um, and they do that by being very specific in their habitat in these really important vernal pools that remain fishless. And we'll talk more on that later. But right now, let's think of where our amphibians are right now. Looking out my window here at the Nature Center in Montpelier, I see some snow cover, but mostly it's gone. But the ground has been doing like a freeze thaw cycle on pretty much a daily basis. So some parts of the ground have thawed right at the very top, but there's still frost below that. This is the same situation, the same meteorological phenomenon that's causing us to have huge frost heaves. It's the thing that makes mud season the worst. Is exactly the phenomenon that our amphibians are tuned into for their overwintering. Above the frost line, we have amphibians that are freeze tolerant. So those are our spring peepers and our wood frogs. They flood their blood with a natural antifreeze that allows them to freeze solid like a froggy ice cube without damaging their tissues. Meanwhile, our mole salamanders, our spotted salamanders, and our yellow spotted salamanders and blue spotted salamanders, and some others in that group go far below the frost line. They're freeze avoidant. They tunnel. They don't actually necessarily dig, but they'll use rodent tunnels or enlarge them to go deep below the frost line. So this is the same place, the same depth that you might put a root cellar. They're avoiding freezing by going deep underground. And this will come up a little bit later as we talk about their migration and the timing of that. But for now, I want to introduce some characters to you. We have lots of different amphibian species in Vermont. Tonight, I'm going to focus on 3 different species, just kind of give you a representation. We have more resources on our website, and Crow's Path and the Vermont Herp Atlas has put out this phenomenal field guide to amphibians of Vermont. But for now, we'll focus on these 3. So first is our spotted salamander. This is really like our flagship mascot of this amphibian road crossing program because they're really big, they're really cute, and they're they're exactly the same colors as a paved road with those yellow spots and black to gray coloring. They're about the size of a Snickers bar, a king-size Snickers bar, that is. And the thing that makes them that gets them their group the name, the mole salamanders, is that fossorial, meaning they live like a fossil underground most of the time. And because they live underground much of the time to stay moist and to avoid predators, and they're nocturnal, it means that while they're common, they're S5, the least endangered species designation in Vermont. They're quite literally all over. Because they live underground and come out at night, it means that humans don't run into them that often. And it makes this migration pattern that they have where they're coming out on these rainy nights in April and we can come in contact with them really, really special. Great. Next, we have the wood frog, also tremendously cute, also common, but these are much smaller. They're about the size of a Reese's peanut butter cup. The smaller ones can be about the size of like the little ones you might get on Halloween, where the larger ones are a king-sized Reese's peanut butter cup. And they're brown to beige. They have really fascinating coloration, where you can see a great identifying feature of them is what we call a dorsolateral ridge. That's this line that goes from their eye to the back of their leg. And it's helpful for identifying them. And it also really helps break up their outline. I have a slide later where I'll show you them in their natural habitat. and that really mimics the mid vein of a leaf. They can look really different and vary uh, in shade, but they will always have that dorsolateral ridge, and they will always have that dark eye mask. Great. Similarly, they're living in forests and eating a lot of invertebrates. These are our most northern range frog in this hemisphere. So they're ones that are really, really well adapted to that cold, and ones that just freeze solid like an ice cube. I see some folks waving their hands. Oh no, the slides have not changed. All right, stop my share. Let me start a new share. How's that? Give me a thumbs up. Great. Thanks so much for your patience. You've missed 2 slides. Here is our very, very charismatic spotted salamander and our wood frog, the great cryptic leaf-colored frog that is full of antifreeze. And you can see on both of these, this is the Vermont Herp Atlas range map of them, where they have photo evidence of them and records within the site, or records within the town. And they like have good coverage through practically all of Vermont. Our next character is rare. We have much less coverage for them, pretty much in just the Champlain Valley and a little bit of the Connecticut River Valley. This is the four-toed salamander. They're much smaller, about the size of a tube of Smarties. And there are a couple ways to identify them, but they have this like really beautiful herringbone pattern down the back. And then if you flip them over on their belly, they have like a bright white belly with like kind of dotted with starry black spots. And these are one of our most rare amphibians in the state, and have been identified as a species of greatest conservation need, largely because their habitat needs are so specific. But more on that later. Great. So I introduced you to these characters, and we'll talk now about how they live, how they migrate, and then what their breeding is like. First, the spotted salamander. Like I said, they're nocturnal, and they're living underground in rodent burrows and root channels, and they're pretty widespread on forest floors. You could look under logs and rocks to find them during the day, because that's where they'll go to stay moist. A lot of amphibians breathe through their skin, and to do that, it has to stay moist at all times. So dehydration can be a really big problem for them, which is why many of them are nocturnal, going out when they're less likely to desiccate. I have found, in all my years of looking for salamanders, I have found a spotted salamander under a rock just one time. And it was really fascinating because I'm used to them being about this big, because I find them during migration when they're migrating to breed. But these salamanders can live for a really long time, and it takes them many years before they're sexually mature to migrate. So this one that I found under a rock was only about that big, and it was truly adorable. A highlight of my summer to find that small, immature teenage spotted salamander. And while those black and yellow spotting patterns like really stand out to us against a black road or against gravel, they can help hide the salamander by breaking up its outline in their natural habitat. Next, we have the wood frog. Again, mostly nocturnal, but these are ones that you might have better luck finding as you walk around in Vermont, because they aren't fossorial. They stay on top of the surface, but you find them in the woods, like their name would suggest. And I tend to find them not actually by sight, because they can be so cryptic, so they can blend in so well. You can see here next to this leaf, it's a spitting image of it. I tend to find them by sound, by walking through a forest and hearing a sound that I don't expect close to my feet. And very often, as I pause and stop and really, really look, it will have been a wood frog that had taken one hop and then frozen to let me walk by. And then last, we have our four-toed salamander, which is rare, especially outside of the Champlain Valley and Connecticut River Valley. But they love forested wetlands. And a fun natural history fact about them is they're one of the species that can drop their tail. If a predator approaches them and grabs onto their tail, they can detach it from their body and scurry away. They'll also do that if they're just very stressed. And the thought is that that tail squirming around can startle the predator or be a distraction from it. And this is just another potential habitat and what that might look like. Great. So returning to this image of where our frogs and salamanders are right now. This is what it looks like on some of the shadier slopes around here. In Montpelier, we have a lot of places where the snow is gone. And I'm starting to expect, especially the frogs, to begin migrating because these warm days can be enough to thaw those frogs out and give them that signal to migrate. Meanwhile, deep below the ground, it takes several days in a row of warm weather for the signal of warm weather above ground to reach below. And we can think that humans think that it's the increase of soil temperature, air temperature, melting snowpack, and especially those first spring rains that bring them out. Remember, all these amphibians need moist skin to survive. So they're really counting on those spring rains to bring that moisture into the environment so that they can move. I also think that spring rains can help trigger migration for the salamanders that are deep underground, because while the ground is insulating them so much, that rain that infiltrates through those burrows can bring that signal of warmer temperature above ground. People will often ask us at the Nature Center if we can predict when salamanders and frogs are migrating. And the answer is yes and no. I think it's largely no. If I'm looking at a specific hillside behind the Nature Center here, maybe I can get a good sense of it. But across the whole state where this whole project is spread, there's no chance that we can give a good forecast for the salamanders. The Harris Center for Conservation Education over in Keene, New Hampshire has some phenomenal communications around their salamander forecast, but that's for like a very, very narrow geographic scope. But I truly recommend subscribing to that. Also, Jim Andrews over at the Vermont Herp Atlas puts out a really great newsletter, and that's where I get some of my information as where things are starting to move. From him, I've heard that there are now some reports in the Champlain Valley of salamanders moving. We have a couple frog migration data points from this year already, from Huntington, I believe. Great. But while it can be a little bit mysterious for humans to predict when the amphibians are moving, it seems that the amphibians often can all be on the same page. Spotted salamanders can travel more than 1/4 miles through the woods to reach breeding pools. And sometimes in this study, 90% of spotted salamanders return to the vernal pool over just 5 days, a really short period there. Amazing synchronicity. So this is what leads to the idea of a big night, or capital T, the capital B, big, capital N night. That idea that there are some nights where it's just phenomenal for amphibian movement. And that is absolutely true sometimes. And we get in our data, we see that there are sometimes, but I will say that there's a leading tail and a tailing tail where early birds and late arrivals will continue to move, will start to move early, and especially will continue to move later in the shadier spots or the places that had more local snowpack through April and into maybe even the first week of May. So this is the habitat arrangement that is best for these amphibians. They have the adult habitat of part hardwood or mixed forest right next to a wetland. I will say that this wetland might be a little bit too big. It's very important for these amphibians to have access to a fishless wetland because their whole strategy, their whole life history strategy is to remain a big fish in a little pond. And even if they're a little fish in a pond with a baby salamander that's about that big and can't swim that fast, they quickly get devoured by the fish. So their prime habitat is the prime habitat for these amphibians is what we call vernal pools. This graphic is from the Vermont Center for Eco Studies Vernal Pool Atlas project, where they've gone out and either remotely or in person identified some potential sites. But vernal pools there are many different definitions depending on who you ask for, but the really important part is that they're wet sometimes and they're dry other times. By drying out, it means that these vernal pools won't ever host permanent predaceous fish populations. But by being wet sometimes, it allows, well, obviously for the amphibians to live, but also like a huge assortment of really unique insects, mollusks, and other invertebrates. This is what a vernal pool might look like throughout the year. And people might say that that's just a glorified puddle, but to these amphibians, it's a glorious puddle because it supplies the aquatic environment they need to reproduce, and yet it doesn't give the fish what they need. So it allows these amphibians, especially these salamanders, to really be the top dogs in these ponds, these pools. So right now, we're starting to see ice out at warmer spots. So we might be at like that second one. And then as all the snowpack melts, the pool expands and expands and expands. And then throughout the spring and into the summer, it dries down and dries down and dries down. And folks have asked me before about the effects of like a dry summer or like a hot spring causing these pools to dry down too quickly. And a clever part of the metabolism of these creatures, as they're cold-blooded, means that as the water warms up, as the puddle gets smaller, their metabolisms speed up. So their growth would speed up, as would the insects, the growth of the insect populations around them. So they really like have like a nice deadline motivation almost to exit their larval form, grow legs, and then crawl into the forest around. But before all that happens, they have to breed. So here we have the spotted salamander. Males typically arrive first to these pools so that they can start jostling with each other and fighting and doing some territorial displays as they compete for the attention of females. And then the females may lay more than 100 eggs, which is actually far less than the wood frog that we'll see later. Oh yeah, here we have a video of what some of these pools look like. It's just truly amazing. This was shot by Larry Klarfeld when he was out surveying for one of these arc transect crossings. And he looked in the ditch to the side and it was just full of salamanders. Oh, my favorite part's coming in. Okay, great. So do you see that salamander going straight at the camera? That is an example of salamander kind of competing and trying to show its fitness. That's what they think, at least, is that as they come into these pools, the males will deposit like this mucousy pedestal, and on top of that put a sperm packet called a spermatophore. And then they'll hang out around by it until a female comes by. And then as that female comes by, they'll do like a little salamander dance. You're like, hey, look how strong I am. Don't you want my genes? And then that female can be directed to choose to take up that sperm. Oh yeah, there we go. On those little pedestals. You can see those like little bits of white in the background that some of those salamanders are interacting with. Those are spermatophores, and on top is that sperm packet. So oftentimes you can go into these pools, these breeding pools, and just see the remnants or the evidence of these salamanders, because they might put their spermatophores down and then like hide in the leaf litter below, but you'll see those little pedestals more obviously. Ooh, here's another one. It's just so amazing. We go all year long with these under our feet. But for these couple special nights in April, we can see them emerge. In the background here, you can hear a couple vocalizations of our frogs. There's kind of like a or like you could think of it as two stones clocking together, or a duck quack. That's the wood frog, and then of course the peeping noise behind that is the spring peeper. Great. That wood frog I was talking about that we heard in that last video, it's one of the first frogs to call in spring. They're really, really cold adapted. They froze solid as frog ice cubes all winter long under just a little bit of leaf litter or in a little bit of mud. So those high temperatures we had last week in the 50s all over the state at this point of wood frogs moving, even to the point where they might be migrating to ponds and then hopping onto ice when they get there. That can put them in danger of desiccation, of dehydration. But they're really, really, really well adapted to being frozen. And that allows them to get to these ponds and pools very early. We call them an explosive breeder because these egg masses that the females lay can have more than 700 eggs on them. Folks have asked me before how all those eggs fit in a small frog or a small salamander. 100 in this nearly life-size rubber salamander I have here, and the answer is that as they are they expand to about this size when they hit the pond water, but inside the animal they're much smaller than that. They expand like chia seeds, or if you're familiar with the kid toy Orbeez, it's the same sort of idea. And then last, we have our four-toed salamander, which is really, really different from how our other amphibians represented here breed. They're actually very different from how most amphibians breed. While our last two had 100 to 700 eggs per female, these four-toed salamanders might have just a dozen or less. And they exercise maternal care for these eggs, which is something that is like really, really unique within amphibians. So the female salamander are the only ones in the four-toed salamanders that migrate in the spring, because they've already bred the fall before in the upland habitat. And they will migrate towards these pools, and it's really important, really specific habitat, because they don't lay their eggs in the pool. Instead, they lay their eggs right next to the pool or in a stump overhanging the pool in damp sphagnum moss. And that sphagnum moss acts like a sponge, soaking up all the rainwater to keep their eggs hydrated and moist until they hatch. And the mother four-toed salamander lays there curled around the eggs to defend them from any invertebrates that might come by and try to eat them. So she's providing maternal care for her eggs, which is like practically unheard of in amphibians in our area. And then as they hatch into their embryo stage, they then plop down directly into the pool or pond that these sphagnum logs are overhanging. And that allows them to skip any like aquatic predators in the egg phase, which can be really, really significant. I've seen raccoons, I've seen coyotes, I've seen foxes, I've seen leeches eating salamander eggs before, but not the four-toed salamander eggs because they're laid on land and much harder to find. Great. So I said earlier that this is the ideal arrangement of habitat with the upland or woods habitat right next to the wetland. But too often in our state, in the developed world, we have a wetland and woods, the two important habitats, but they're bifurcated, they're separated by a road. And in those cases, these amphibians are exposed to predators, but one of their highest causes of mortality can just be road collisions. And just 10% of amphibian population, this is for spotted salamanders, 10% of them getting squished each year can lead to the local extinction, the extirpation of that amphibian population. Spotted salamanders won't be reproductively mature until they're 5 years old. And the oldest known spotted salamander was 32. But they still, every year when they're breeding, have to cross the road, and they're doing so at a really slow pace. Remember, this is happening at like 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and they're cold-blooded, and their metabolism is dependent on ambient temperature. So it can be really, really impactful to these populations. So we have the Amphibian Road Crossing Program, or the ARC program. And we have 4 main goals in it. The first of which is just to increase public education in amphibian conservation. So for you 39 people, give yourself a pat on the back for being publicly engaged in amphibian conservation. Next, we want to just immediately and directly reduce amphibian mortality at road crossing sites. This is something that we can do to help the individual amphibians that we see. Third, we really want to provide robust data for transportation planning and to reduce mortality at these road crossings. It often can be the case as funding becomes available for VTrans or for a local municipality, or like with the Inflation Reduction Act, that there could be money for wildlife crossing structures, or there could be money for transportation planning that that has positive impacts on wildlife. But then for them to have to do a study to find where these sites are very important or to prioritize that can take a lot more time. So we're hoping to collect data from all across the state and to curate it in a way that it's useful for these planners. It also really helps that these crossing sites can be like very local, or like have very local impacts, where we might not be able to do anything for the species spotted salamander, but we can really do things for the population that is living in the pool behind the rec center by directing people there, by engaging people there in local conservation. And then last, we want to make sure that our data is available to statewide biodiversity data for conservation research. We have a phenomenal amount of data, and it's really unique that we are able to gather so much. These events where these amphibians are easy to survey, easy to interact with, might only happen 1 or 4 nights a year. And across the whole state, to hire enough undergrads, to hire enough research interns to survey all the roads that we survey would be like an impossible grant writing task or an impossible research objective. But through community science, through volunteer education, we've been able to cover a lot of that so that researchers could use it. Cool. So yeah, so this could be a potential outcome. We have some wins, not necessarily from our program, but from amphibian conservation generally, that I'll talk later about in Moncton, where they installed a huge project, a huge amphibian road crossing structure that cost $330,000. But it could also just be as simple as raising the community awareness and like speaking out at town meeting to close a wetland road in nocturnal hours for 2 nights a year when amphibian migration is predicted to be in process. So that's the sort of local connection that we hope that we can help create. This is the road crossing site in Moncton I was talking about. This was installed a few years back and has been phenomenally successful. It had been known as a site where lots of wildlife and lots of amphibians were colliding with cars for years and years. But after they put in this crossing structure where the amphibians would run into that wall and then turn to go underneath the road. They put up a camera and just found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of salamanders using these passes. Interestingly, like normal game cameras on normal settings wouldn't necessarily work. So this was actually taking a time lapse because game cameras usually use like heat signatures to trigger motion detection, but these amphibians are practically the same temperature as the ground at this point, so they weren't triggering it. But set on time lapse, you could see just hundreds of these salamanders crossing under this road safely. Well, yeah, in the chat talking about how many other animals will also use these crossing structures. They're phenomenal places to observe wildlife, and we're really lucky that we have some great ones in the state. Great. So how do you get involved? First, you can attend a webinar like this. Next, you can go on our website um, and find the amphibian road crossing map. Let's see, I'm going to brave screen share one more time. Hang on. You know what? I'm actually not. Believe me, if you go on our website, you will find at northbranchnaturecenter.org/amphibian conservation a link to a map. As you click on that map, if you're zoomed way out, you'll just see these different colored dots. And then if you zoom way into East Hill Road here, you'll see this pink line appear. Those dots represent the middle of these routes. And then the pink line is the exact route that we want people to walk. Obviously, if you're coming on East Hill Road, we don't want you to drive over this pink line because we expect that pink line to be where the actual, thanks Helen for putting the map in the chat. That's where we expect actual amphibians to be moving. So we'd ask that you park outside that pink line and then walk exactly that pink line. We're doing these as transects. So you'll take your data sheet and record data as you walk from one end of the line to the other. Then when you get there, you'll flip it over and do a another recording of data as you walk back. These transects are all about the same length, and by doing it at a transect, we're able to compare apples to apples for these sites across the state, across years, and it gives us a lot more comparable data that's much more useful for research. So once you understand where the transect starts and ends, there's some pop-ups that will tell you more information about the site. On the web interface, you can click on the dot and it will tell you things like the sorts of species that have been there, how many amphibians have been counted there, and the amphibians and traffic per hour. So there are some places where there are lots of amphibians seen, and those are great places to survey. And there are also, there also can be places where you might see that like there's like 18 cars per hour. And knowing that, it might be a place where you wouldn't want to necessarily take kids. We want everyone doing this project to first prioritize their own safety and their own comfort. So we offer a lot of different sites with a lot of different arrangements. Some are way, way back on dirt roads that don't receive a lot of traffic. The amphibians crossing there probably would be safe because there's not a lot of traffic, but we still want to count them and confirm that they're there. The monitoring data is helpful, and that allows people who won't necessarily have comfort being on a highly trafficked route get out there. Other places, there's like known to be lots of amphibian car collisions, and people can get out there too and save a lot of amphibians. There have been some places where people have suggested on really busy highways where we had a site before and we ended up taking it off because we had reports that while there were a lot of amphibians there and there were a lot of cars there, there wasn't a shoulder or the sites didn't seem safe. So we asked that everyone uses their common sense and comfort to guide what sites they choose to survey. And definitely let us know if something feels like it's not safe for you to be out there. So after you understand where this transect starts and ends, go out and visit on rainy nights during early spring. The guidelines that I say for when amphibians might migrate here in Montpelier, of course it's different in different parts of the state, is the first rainy night, like fully dark, in April after all but the most persistent of snowbanks have melted. So that's soon for us. We have seen some amphibian movement in the Champlain Valley already. We have a couple reports from Huntington and our data too. But after you visit those sites on rainy nights, you'll walk your transect going down the road along that pink line. And as you're there, you will escort amphibians off the road, counting them on this data sheet. You can see it says the different species of salamanders and frogs, and the number that you see live and the number that you see dead. We do ask that folks take the dead animals off the road for a couple reasons. One, we want to make sure they're not double counted. If someone else goes and surveys after you, we don't want them to count the same dead salamanders and frogs that you did. And second, it's actually like ecologically important for you to take them off the road because those dead salamanders are a source of food that scavengers like raccoons or possums, foxes, coyotes, bobcats, all these different animals, barred owls might be eating, and having them be in the roadway is leading those scavengers to be at risk of collision. We also ask that you photograph the rare ones. I have this in quotes here because what I really mean is photograph anything that you're not certain of. We have a link on our website where you could submit photos that you aren't certain of, and that we link that to the data so that we can then look at those photos, identify them, make sure that the data is all set before it goes to researchers, and then I'll send you an email saying, you were right. You sent me a photo of a weird looking spring peeper, and it was a weird looking spring peeper. And I can give you some more information. We also ask for photos of the rare ones, specifically the blue spotted salamander, the four-toed, and the Jefferson or blue spotted hybrid, and the Jefferson salamander, because some of those they occur like in patchy distributions in Vermont. So it can be like very important to have photo evidence of them to update statewide distribution maps. We've had that through our data here at the Nature Center, where we've added, I know just 2 years ago, we added East Montpelier for Jefferson salamanders. It was the first ever recorded Jefferson salamander in that town. And it was great to have a photo. And then it was great. I like went to that site the next night and found a couple too, which was really, really exciting. And then after you've done all that, you'll flip your data sheet over and then repeat for the return walk. These data sheets are available on our website, and you can print them off at home, or you can just you could do it in any way that makes sense. Personally, I don't carry this whole data sheet with me. I have recorded these headings in a notebook that I just keep in my pocket to keep it nice and dry. My coworker Sean just does it directly on his phone because eventually, after you record the data on the sheet, when you return home, you'll record it, you'll enter it on our website anyway. So Sean just enters it straight as he's surveying. I tend to write it down and then enter it after I've gotten some rest and come out of the rain. Included on here too are also road conditions, whether it's wet or dry, how rainy it is, and the number of cars passing during the survey. If you see anyone else while you're out there, you should record that as well as survey start and end time. Great. And then congratulate yourself. You've helped amphibians at your site and across Vermont. Next, I have a couple notes on what you might need To keep the animals safe, first I say clean, asterisk, wet, and low hands. Clean because clean doesn't mean like freshly washed or freshly put on hand sanitizer. We're really worried about the amphibian safety. And remember, they're breathing through their skin. It's really sensitive. Wouldn't want to get in your eyeball. Like spicy food or chemicals, perfume, bug spray, sunscreen. Those are things that could really hurt the amphibian. So clean doesn't mean having those things on it. I like to get my hands muddy. I'll just like move them through the mud that the amphibian is in to help protect it from anything on my hands. And then wet to keep them moist, and low because if you have a frog and it jumps out of your hand, you want that to happen at approximately 0 centimeters of elevation. For frogs, we have some great frog. Oh no, that's not the photo I thought. Good frog carrying technique is to have one hand below and one hand above to cover them. They're very slippery. These animals are covered in mucus and they can slide between your fingers much easier than you think. So it's really good to keep your hands low as well. And really handle only when necessary. So if they're 95% of the way across the road, you can just let them walk the other 5%. And if you want to like take photos, for instance, or like just hang out with the critter a little bit more, what I recommend is just bringing an empty Tupperware with you. And then you can remove that salamander and put it in the Tupperware and then not touch it as you admire it for a little while and then transfer it to the side of the road. That will help it keep from getting too stressed out. You'll also, of course, to keep yourself safe, will need flashlights and extra batteries. I prefer to survey with a really bright headlamp on my head. And then also I'll carry a flashlight and I'll sweep the flashlight low against the ground because that can help cast shadows that help me find these small, slow moving animals below our feet. You'll also want reflective vests, your brightest and best, because we are doing these on sometimes on back roads, always in the rain, and always at night. So we want to make sure that cars coming around the corner can readily see us. If you do come across a car, I like to suggest to people that they don't leave their flashlight pointing at the car, but maybe like give it a pass so that they can see your light and then shine your light on yourself so that you're very obvious, or step off the road entirely. And of course, the things to keep yourself warm and dry. Camera is great for photography, or a smartphone for data entry. For moving the dead amphibians off the roadway in particular, folks like to bring spatulas rather than touch them with their own hands. That can also be better for the health of the live amphibians you're touching, as well as a clean bucket. There have been times in which there's so many amphibians crossing the road that the most efficient thing to do is to take them 10 or 20 at a time in a bucket, move that bucket across the road, and then keep moving forward. And then if you're using a data sheet, bring that data sheet. And I do suggest printing off the protocol manual just to keep in your car to like more immediately refresh yourself on the very particulars of surveying. And there's some really helpful identification tips in there for all of the amphibian species that we expect to come across. Next, I have a couple videos of what this looks like. So this is the actual pace that we expect you'll be going on a slow night when there aren't a lot of amphibians to cross. This is actually like quite fast. You end up going on a really slow walk and sweeping your flashlight across the whole roadway. These folks partnered up to go side by side to cover the roadway, and you can see that they have their headlamps on, and then they're using their flashlights going back and forth to try to cast shadows to help see these amphibians. Because this is what they look like. This spotted salamander just took a little bit of a break in a wet spot in the road as it's gathering its strength to continue migrating. And this is a high quality professional salamander move. Notice she's keeping the salamander pretty close to the ground. This one was so cold it was barely moving, and she was confident that it wouldn't squirm out of her hands. I would say though that I would prefer to use two hands and to keep the salamander a little bit lower to the ground. The last point here too, you'll notice as she comes to the side of the road, there's a really steep snowbank, which the salamander would have really struggled to come up and over, both because it's very steep and hard to climb, and that snowbank would be cooling the salamander and reducing its metabolic rate as it went. So it would be moving slower and slower as it spends more time on the snow. That can be really dangerous. So Allison here move that salamander to the far side of that, so it's at least downhill for it to continue to its breeding pool. Lastly, I'll say always move amphibians in the direction that they're pointing. They know where they're going better than we do. For instance, if this salamander is pointing at a nice pool, a nice pond, you'd move it that way. But if it was pointing in the other direction, maybe what had happened is that salamander moved into the pool, into the pond, looked around, and decided to move to another pond. Now, that is something that's rarer. Most salamanders return to the pond that's closest to them. But in those rare cases where salamanders move into one and then move further away, that's really, really important for the population genetics of these species. That allows the genes to spread. It allows the population to be more genetically diverse. So we always want to help them in the direction that they're pointing rather than try to do any correction. Great. So how are we doing so far? We have 1,178 surveys that has counted 22,536 amphibians with 670 hours of surveys. On average, we have about 3 people doing surveys at a time. So the person hours are nearing 2,000 for about 218 surveyed sites. These range all over Vermont, with some sites that we still need folks to go to. Those are marked in red on our web map, and some sites that are popular every year. Great. So now get signed up. We have a mailing list that we'll occasionally use to send out news, specifically for amphibians, and then get out on rainy nights. Cool. And yeah, if you have any more questions, you can reach out to info@northbranchnaturecenter.org or just ash@northbranchnaturecenter.org. The salamander questions to info get forwarded to me anyway. But at this point, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat and I'll get to them. Okay, Helen is asking, when's the best time to arrive on site? So salamanders will begin moving after, frogs and salamanders will begin moving after sunset. I find that it's best to arrive like fully, when it's fully dark, at least an hour after sunset is what I'd suggest. That said, oftentimes in our data, people will observe that like one year there's great salamander and frog movement, and the next year we won't see that much movement at all. And really what that ends up being is not that the amphibians didn't move, because if you go to the pools, you'll see eggs, you'll see those spermatophore towers, but it was just that it rained at 3 in the morning, and human volunteers, human surveyors are not willing to set an alarm for 3 a.m. because there's a predicted rainstorm then. So we're hoping that the rain and the darkness occurs as close to human bedtime as possible. Jean asked what kind of gloves Allison was wearing. Those were nitrile gloves, just like from a first aid kit. That can protect you if you don't want to get salamander slime on your hands. And it's also really, really nice for the salamanders. That way you don't have to worry about any lotion that you put on your hands. and it's really good for their care. Janira asks, how long should you stay on at the site? So the way that this is set up, it's set up so that every person is empowered to watch this webinar, to read our protocol, and to find a site on our map and go. And then you can just go when it's raining and the desire strikes you. There's no need to coordinate with me. There's no need to sign up for a site specifically. Go when you want to, when you can, when your other responsibilities don't prevent you from being out on a muddy road in the middle of a rainy night in April. And then when you get there, stay as long as you want. I ask, mostly I hope that people submit two surveys, one going out and one going back. And it's totally fine if both of those have zeros. Knowing that there were no amphibians crossing at a site is actually really important ecological data, because then we know someone was there checking. I'll also say that sometimes when I'm doing this personally, if I'm going there, I'll always submit my one data sheet front and back. But if there's just so many amphibians crossing, at some point I might put the data sheets down and just help them cross, or just observe them there. The data is really important for all sorts of goals that I outlined. But at some point, if it feels like it's getting in the way of directly moving the salamanders and directly impacting their survival, let the data take a back seat and your experience or the survival of the amphibians take priority. Great. Underhills. Ooh, okay. Leslie's asking about sites in Underhill Center, that there's not sites recommended nearby. So what I think you should do if there's not a site nearby you is ask around, or like look around for potential crossing sites. Potential crossing sites are where there's a wetland on one side of the road and a forest on the other side of the road. I will say we're very careful to not to encourage people to be like out and driving long distances on these rainy migration nights, because we don't want to be putting more traffic on the roads. So go to the nearest site where you think amphibians might be crossing. We also have a link on our website where you could submit a site, so that I can get it onto the map this season, or sometime over next winter, probably, when we'll turn our attention to administering this program again. Yeah, sites have appeared on our map from many different levels. Some have just been known crossing sites that people have told us about, or like send us a snail mail letter and say, hey, this road in Worcester always has amphibians on it in the spring, and then we can put it on the map so other people know. And then other times, one of our staff members here has just been able to look at Google Maps and said, oh, okay, let's put in some crossing sites in Cornwall. I can see from Google Maps, this is wetland, this is forest, here's a road. And we put a site there, and then a volunteer shows up and takes a look at it and confirms that there are amphibians crossing. I got a direct message asking if people can visit the same site on different nights. 100% yes, absolutely. That is great. Visiting the same site on different nights helps us get a better sense, helps the data show a better sense of when the amphibians are actually crossing. I tend to go to the same sites here in Montpelier, partially because there's so much amphibian movement around that I feel stuck. As I zoom into the map and see the pink lines, I understand that if I go too far north, I cross the site by Wrightsville Reservoir, and I don't want to drive through that and potentially run over any amphibians. So I just stay very local and visit the same sites often. Ooh, Steve says VT Photo Tours offers fun workshops for photographing amphibians in Moncton and Charlotte. Oh, that's great. I find them really hard to photograph. All these photos my coworker Sean or other members of our team took, and the glare on them, because they're always wet and it's always at night and it's always raining, makes it really challenging. That sounds like a great opportunity. Great. Cool. Any other questions? I have some other opportunities to get involved lined up here. If you're interested in amphibian conservation and throughout the year, not just in these big nights in April, you can connect with our friends at Vermont Center for Eco Studies for the Vernal Pool Monitoring Project or their Vernal Pool Atlas project. The Vernal Pool Atlas just asks that folks go out and like just get eyes on these places that they think there are vernal pools to make sure that the vernal pool is still there and it hasn't been developed, for instance. Whereas the monitoring project, you go off out typically with a partner and you return to these same puddles like several times throughout the spring, summer, and fall to get a good sense of who's there, doing surveys for eggs and for invertebrates. They put out audio recordings to record, or audio recording devices to record the time at which spring peepers, for instance, were singing. And they're doing some really cool science from that. So if you want to get more involved with that, you can email vpmon@vermontecostudies.org. And then, yeah, this is the Atlas project, which is easier to step in and out of and less of a time commitment, but still phenomenally important. These vernal pools are really like the coral reefs of some of our terrestrial and upland aquatics habitats. Great. Janir is asking if I had the experience of trying to stop cars if there are tons of amphibians crossing. At the individual scale, we certainly don't recommend that people go into the roadway to try to stop cars. The most important thing for the continuity of this project is that people don't get hurt doing it. So we're always recommending that people prioritize their safety first. And that's by stepping off the roadway, by shining a brief light at the driver and then shining their light at themselves. Where we do, though, recommend that people stop cars is through like town governance. We've had some progress in towns like Heartland or Richmond where people are starting to get curious about either installing an amphibian road crossing structure like an underpass under the road, or it could be as simple as a road closure on a less traveled road only during night for 2 nights in April. Just raising this awareness person to person or in local governance allows people to at least have that idea that they shouldn't be on the road as much as possible during these rainy nights in April. Great. Well, folks, if there are any other questions, I just want to thank everyone for their time tonight. Thanks all for learning with me about amphibians, and I hope you can get out there. The weather, this freeze thaw that we're having right now, and the dryness or snow only means that I think it'll be another week before we have crossing conditions in my area. But we're starting to see crossing happen in different parts of the state. So really keep your eye out there and don't get discouraged if they're not there the first time. If people go out too early, they often might say, "Oh, there are no amphibians out," but they're just still underground. And migration will happen. It happens every year, and it will continue to happen for as long as the amphibians crawl across this earth. Another question, is the Herp Atlas still the best resource for learning the field marks? Herp Atlas is great. They collaborated on this field guide handout that I really love. We also have like a quick primer on our website as well in the volunteer manual for this project. Great. All right. Thanks so much, everybody.